Welcome to today's industry seminar with the Harvard Data Science Initiative. This spring term, I'm delighted to share that we're doing something a little different. As you might have seen, we're in the first of 4 seminars, a special series on the topic of data leadership, co-hosted with our friends at the Harvard John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Over the course of the spring, we'll explore issues around data ethics, digital trust, data governance, and regulation with industry experts from sectors like life sciences, NGOs, and consumer products. And a very big thanks to McKinsey & Company for helping us put together the series. Today's seminar is called The Chief Trust Officer, What It Means to Be a Technical Leader. We're delighted to have with us Mike Towers, Chief Digital Trust Officer at Takeda, and Liz Grennan, an expert associate partner at McKinsey. Together, they bring a wealth of expertise in the ethical, legal, and regulatory issues surrounding data and digital information. So we're super honored to have them with us for this discussion and to kick off this series. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that Mike and Liz will take questions over the Zoom Q&A function. So please don't be shy. Ask early, ask often. Liz, Mike, I'll turn this over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jen, and great to be here and great to have Mike here with us. I am Liz Grennan, an associate partner with McKinsey out of our Stamford office. I am also the global co-leader and founder of Digital Trust service line at McKinsey that focuses on de-risking across data, technology, analytics, AI, et cetera. I have spent 20 years as a lawyer, largely focused on analytics and data issues. I've been the general counsel of 2 different analytics startups, one in the intelligence community and one in insurance. And I have most recently at McKinsey led the legal and risk teams globally for McKinsey Digital and shifted over to consulting about 1.5 years ago. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Mike Towers, who is a Chief Digital Trust Officer, and I'll let Mike introduce himself, but a complete pioneer in this field. And over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks everybody for taking the time. So I'm Mike Towers. As was mentioned, I'm the Chief Digital Trust Officer at Takeda. For those of you who may not know Takeda, we are a biopharmaceutical company headquartered in Japan, and our offices are, the US headquarters is in Cambridge. So I work not too far from campus. And I've been in life sciences and biopharmaceuticals now since, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but it's been 28 years. Started in 1994, worked my way up through the ranks in various technology roles, and started to get a little bit more involved in, I'll call it business partnering type roles. And then I shifted into security and risk management leadership about 2008, so about 15 years ago. And I've had various security roles. And then I've been in the digital trust officer role now since April of 2022. It's been exciting, and it's something that I think the industry definitely needs, and I'm looking forward to talking with all of you about it.
And I agree that the industry needs digital trust. I think all companies need it. I think society is coming to expect it, and it's really the foundation of our data and digital-driven economy. So Mike, I'll be asking you questions. I know that you are an expert, especially in pharma. And I'd love just for you to talk about how are data and digital central to pharma, and what are the headwinds, what are the tailwinds, why is trust necessary? What are the trends here in pharma in particular?
Yeah, Liz, it's a great question. I mean, in a word, totally. Data and digital is completely and totally transforming pharma, and it's through all aspects of the value chain, everywhere from in research and development to manufacturing, to commercial where the products are sold, and even in our post-treatment care, which is one of the newer areas, and we'll talk about that shortly. It's important to note that biopharmaceuticals is a subsector of the broader industry of healthcare. So many of the other subsectors, I'm sure, are well aware of: medical devices, payers or insurance providers, actual care providers, so doctors, hospitals, medical practices, et cetera. All of them are contributors to the healthcare sector. And as I think probably you all are aware and you felt, traditionally biopharmaceuticals and healthcare overall has had great clinical innovation. When you think about anybody who's had a knee or a back injury, or more seriously, maybe even organ transplants, you know that stuff like that is much better than it was, and we make continued clinical innovation. But the delivery of healthcare, frankly, has been quite inefficient. We think about it, it's very in-person centric. I can tell you a story about what really started, frankly, making me think about this whole challenge is my wife and I were on vacation in Scottsdale, Arizona, and she wasn't feeling well. We had to go to urgent care. And I was handed a clipboard with a pen and 5 pieces of paper to fill out. And I started to say to myself, I can go to any airport in the world and hand them my passport and buy a ticket. And my identity is confirmed. Why is this so hard? So where can we transform? You start thinking about things like digital and device companions, health and condition management. And you'll hear more about this concept of values-based healthcare, where you're capturing outcomes, which is another important piece where this is changing. And let's face it, tech companies are stepping into this void and are definitely providing more patient empowerment in overall care. So that's from a healthcare perspective. Specific to biopharmaceuticals, you start thinking about the ability to recruit clinical trials patients, collect their consent digitally from a privacy perspective. We can develop apps that help patients to better manage their conditions or their disease. We can help them manage their medication. Digital advancements can help us connect and reuse data to enable better scientific advancement and breakthroughs. So all of these advances in tech are really, really important. And I think from a transformation perspective, the last thing I'll say is to think about this from a personal perspective. We're all patients. We all experience this. Hopefully some not as much as we'd like, or others who have more serious health conditions, but we're all patients. And think about the data and the engagements that are in scope for you. And when you start doing about that, you start thinking about the digital engagements and the data exchange that's necessary for this industry, you're not booking airline tickets or hotel rooms anymore. The level of responsibility is a whole different level when you start thinking about managing this data and these engagements.
Yeah, Mike, I'm currently, as we all sit here watching this, I'm currently wearing an Apple Watch that I use because I don't get many steps in, being so committed to my desk and my Zoom during the day. Are we now all sitting here producing health data? Is this something where we're all, yes, we are all patients, but as we sit here at our jobs or in our student settings, what data are we, what data is being collected?
Well, if anybody who wears a device like an iWatch or a Fitbit, what's interesting is that there is health data being captured. I mean, of course, whether or not it can be used and whether it should be used and how it should be used are whole different levels and whole different discussions, which is frankly where digital trust comes in. But I think it's another really good example of where the tech companies are really, really innovating here and stepping in, frankly, and disrupting a little bit where innovation is needed.
Yep.
I mean, in many, many hospitals, frankly, if you walk into a hospital and you get your blood pressure taken, that's a regulated process that someone has to document, potentially with a pen or a paper. Yet Fitbit and iWatch can collect tens of thousands of blood pressure readings in a minute. And so it's definitely a different trend we're seeing here. So a lot of data that can be captured, a lot of data that if you're wearing some sort of wearable, whatever, you likely are generating it. And then we talk about how and where we can capture it.
Yeah, I think I spend so much time focused on exactly as you say, can you use the data? And if you can use the data, should you use the data? And if you should use the data, how should you use the data? And I think all of those questions go in under the heading of trust, because companies make those decisions. Well, they should make those decisions very strategically on a daily basis. I think a lot of companies are making those decisions in an ad hoc way and making them in the field, and different parts of the company are making different decisions. So I'm a huge believer, as you know, in the concept of digital trust. It is an enterprise-wide effort. How did that go at Takeda for you? How did the concept of digital trust become an enterprise-wide mandate and a role created? I think you just walked through this journey. How did that work for you in Takeda?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an interesting one because, of course, you could think about this from a broad industry perspective, and you could think about this from a Takeda perspective. As I should have mentioned in my introduction, I also sit on the board of the Health ISAC, which is an organization whose mission is to collectively work together across the industry and improve resiliency and improve sustainability from a technology perspective. So some of this applies not only to biopharma, but to the healthcare system overall. So for Takeda specifically, first of all, the foundation of our value system was a great start. So anybody who's familiar with Takeda, or if you're not, you go to our website. We have a very, very rich and deep, and frankly, something I'm very proud of, a value system. And it's quite simply 4 words: patient, trust, reputation, and business, in that order. So trust is a fundamental element of our value system, and it has been for a while. And we already felt that our obligations to protect were starting to shift, frankly, to resiliency based on the risks, based on the threats. The more the company becomes dependent on technology, the more resiliency becomes really, really important. So that's a shift that we were seeing. And we started to think bigger than us. This wasn't just about Takeda as the enterprise. This is about the entire ecosystem. When you start thinking about patients, caregivers, physicians, et cetera. So thinking more broadly from an ecosystem perspective. And then lastly, we started thinking about the level of responsibility, like I was mentioning before. Level of responsibility and risk the data and digital engagement carries. We're talking about different types of data. We're talking about different levels of engagement. And we're talking about a different level of scale. Takeda is a large company. If you count our contractors, we have about 70,000 workers that connect to our network on a daily basis across about 85 countries. That's a big company. But when we start thinking about engaging with patients and physicians, those numbers can get into the millions very, very quickly. So the scale is completely different.
Yeah,
And
scale's a big issue.
Yeah. And pharma's had trust issues in the past. Let's face it. Well, I mean, anybody who's seen a movie in the 80s or 90s, the bad guy was probably a pharma exec. So we have a lot of work to do to rebuild and restore that. And today, our reputation indicators in pharma are efficacy, quality, sales practices, and pricing. Those are basically the 4 triggers of reputation. But at some point soon, if we do this well, how we capture and manage the data and how we engage digitally will be another one.
Mike, do you think people are aware of how companies use their data? Like, do you think when you think about trust and its stakeholders, and what is the approach you think that consumers are taking? Are they new to this? Are they just discovering what rights they might have? Are they are they normative? Like, are they thinking through prescriptively? Like, I really would like you to be very transparent and your own values that you've patient trust, reputation, business, in that order, like that patient centricity. Do you think that consumers are aware of companies that do this well and companies that do not do this well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in some respects, frankly, this depends on, the generation and your age, frankly. We can talk a little bit later about, the type of advice we would give to students or folks who are learning this. But obviously, the younger generation is more digitally savvy and are expecting more of these things to be collected and expecting a direct digital engagement almost in every part of their lives. And I think it depends on the sector and maybe depends on the transaction or the engagement you're thinking about. I suspect that for many people, let's keep in mind, trust is a personal thing that you feel, and it's earned, it's not given. But at some point, there are certain industries that you may engage with, whether you're buying a new phone or you're like I said before, you're booking a hotel or you're doing something, you're getting groceries delivered to your home. Maybe the level of data that's being collected doesn't carry the same responsibility of trust, if you will, that you would expect for them than, say, if you're engaging in some sort of healthcare delivery. So I think a lot of it depends on the sector. And I do think, when you start thinking and hearing and seeing about the some of the breaches that hit the press or whatever, or, how many of us are talking with our friends about this cool pair of boots that we saw, and we're chatting about it. And then the next day when we're on Gmail, there's 7 or 8 advertisements about them, and you wonder how the heck that happened. So it's almost a subconscious thing that happens, or that is going on from a behavioral, I would say, analytics perspective, that it's something that we're living with on a day-to-day basis, and the expectations vary by industry of how well that will be used.
Yeah, I think as we think through what's the evolution of both the expectation from the different stakeholders, I'll take this to a legal question. I think that before there was a famous case called Caremark, for any of you law students in the audience, and beyond law. Caremark introduced the concept of board personal liability. And when I think through who are the stakeholders in the trust equation, consumers always, of course, come to mind, all of them. And then I also think about, companies' employees and, just the general public, whether or not they patronize the company. And then I also think about the board. The board, as the litigation and as the case law develops, are increasingly liable for how data is stewarded at an organization, which is appropriate. It's a key asset And I think that knowledge and awareness and responsibility are appropriately levied on the board. But as you think through trust stakeholders and who you are answering to, and kind of harkening back to your own framework on trust, who are the stakeholders in trust? Like who does it, what is the value of trust across the different stakeholders?
Yeah, so first and foremost, to your point, I'll call it the custodian or the person whose data is, linked to, they're a very, very important and the most important stakeholder. So whose data is being captured? What are you capturing from them? And then why are you capturing it? So it's important from a stakeholder perspective that that's clear, understood, and frankly, very, very transparent. And then you have other stakeholders from a business perspective and from I'll call it a control function perspective, that are also important stakeholders in how that may be collected and how it may be used. You have a privacy, as I mentioned before, a really important privacy element. You have an ethical element. Many companies are starting to think about responsible innovation and ethical technology and ethical analytics, which is one of the big components that we're focusing on at Takeda. And there's an ethical piece that's required as well. Legally, from a regulatory perspective, especially in healthcare, that's an important stakeholder as well. And then obviously from an overall business perspective and business leadership perspective, everything from the leadership to the board, as you mentioned, or even your shareholders, if you're a publicly traded company, they're an important stakeholder as well, because the more you do this and the more data you collect, the more likely your reputation could be impacted if you don't do it well or don't do it properly.
I think of my work very vocationally, and I get incredibly passionate about thinking through data health. And I say that, and it sounds intangible, but a good friend and colleague of mine, Kasia Shimolinski, did some amazing work out of Berkman Klein and MIT Media Lab to focus on the health of data sets. And when I think about, particularly in healthcare, the fact that data is unrepresentative of the actual population, I mean, it feels like a very, very poignant social issue of our time that unhealthy, to use that metaphor, unhealthy data sets are rendering certain people groups either systematically excluded from an opportunity or unmet needs are so systematic in healthcare, excluded from clinical trials across pharma. When I think about data health and I think about trust, how do you think through bias issues and just ensuring that sort of the representative population, there is data, just taken from these groups, and how do you test data once you plan to use it in some analytic use case?
Yeah, it's a new and evolving practice area, and I think anybody who's seen the news lately or sensed all of the growth with things like OpenAI and ChatGPT, you realize how much this is exploding. But I think it presents a lot of interesting ethical questions. We mentioned this before. One of the things that we've developed internally is a series of principles of how we're going to do this. Whether or not you actually have to collect the data, making sure you're absolutely transparent with how it's being used, making sure that there's a need to know, appropriate intent. Making sure human beings are always involved. Don't just let any engine or algorithm do anything. Recognizing there's going to be bias depending on who trains the algorithms. So all that is really, really important from an overall ethical perspective. And interestingly enough, not internally Takeda, but when I was presenting and discussing this broadly speaking from an overall healthcare perspective, I remember putting up a picture of Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, who had one of the great quotes in this area when he was talking about genetic engineering to make the dinosaurs. He said, sometimes scientists think so quickly about whether or not they could, they don't stop to think about whether or not they should. And that's a really, really important thing to continue to test, and especially from a healthcare perspective, because of some of the other inequities and the care challenges that we're having or whatever. It's really, really important that the data and the ethical parameters within which you're using the data are top of mind and get a lot of focus.
I love the Jurassic Park reference. I mean, that's a visceral example of what happens, science fiction notwithstanding, what happens when I think short-term decision-making trumps long-term wisdom. Okay, so we're here. Let's assume we're all here considering careers in pharma or careers in data and the digital economy. How shall we all think about trust across the value spectrum at a company. And I say that there are prospective data scientists, data engineers. I get probably as safely an email a week from an early tenured McKinsey employee who has just finished a dual degree in, say, computer science and law, or philosophy, ethics, and applied AI. There's a growing cohort of very passionate people on these topics, which is really motivating and fascinating. As future employees of companies like Takeda, how shall we think about where we might bring trust along the full value chain of an industry?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I think one of the first things to think about is how trust can directly link to reputation. And as I mentioned before, understanding that trust is a personal feeling. I mean, the tendency in our field from a technological perspective is to think in terms of bits and bytes, networking and devices, et cetera, apps, whatever the technology components are. But everything about trust is personal, it's human. It's earned, it has context, and it has perspective. Trust is a concept we all intuitively understand in our interpersonal relationships. And there are great analogies of how trust can be developed and maintained with the little things done consistently. And this is how, frankly, it can and should be embedded across the company. So when you're looking for an employee or employer, thinking about whether or not you can sense that or feel it. The other thing to recognize about trust is it's gained in drops, but it's lost in buckets. So it takes a while to build up trust. You need to earn it, like I said before, but mistakes can impact it negatively quite quickly, or other issues. From an overall business perspective, how does trust impact your bottom line? What is the impact business strategy on growth and growth prospects for trust? Back to pharma, if we're going to engage with data and digital directly, especially when we're talking to patients and HCPs who have historically been abstracted. In biopharma, most patients and HCP engagement were abstracted through third parties, whether it's a clinical research partner, whether it's through the physicians themselves. So having that direct engagement requires new focus. And how much can the digital trust directly impact your reputation? Again, if this is done widespread, and you think about what experiences that the data and digital may be providing your stakeholders, trust can be impacted differently if that gets impacted in any way. And the last thing I would say is that because trust is so personal and it is so human, it's always going to be strongly connected with the culture, the values of the company. Use that as a starting point. And then you need to make things easy so that your processes and systems and trust, privacy, and ethical settings are all something that people feel by design. And think about that from a perspective alongside some of the really deep and cool technical stuff, because at some point they're all going to fit together. And that's where trust really, really shines through, is if you can match that technological delivery mindset with the human side of doing it well and making sure that you maintain the trust when you do it.
Yeah, I think I've heard many times things like, oh, legal has got that, or the data scientists will handle it, or I think the marketing team does it different, or it really depends on the jurisdiction, meaning these all point to silos and ad hoc decision making. And you raise, rightly so, that trust is personal, but in that way, trust can be highly subjective, right? What I trust might be different than what you trust. My expectations might be different than yours, regardless of age, regardless of gender, we all have our different subjective approaches to this. So when I think about an organization having trust principles and ethical principles, we've all seen like, be a good human and don't do evil, and very high level, maybe operationalized, maybe not within an organization. But I'd love to talk about objective pragmatics. So yes, it's personal, and yes, people really do experience trust personally, and certainly on a consumer basis. I feel like, especially with healthcare in particular, I feel like I really want to work with trusted companies, to patronize trusted companies, healthcare providers, et cetera. But I think to make it pragmatic across an organization, I wonder how you think through an enterprise-wide approach. So do you at Takeda think, okay, well, we have to have an enterprise strategy and it has to be mandatory. And then once it's mandatory, we have to train people on this, meaning what's the full promulgation across an enterprise to make it actually operationalized versus kind of resting on an influence model, or decisions made ad hoc, or random people having their own particular set of what's right, not stress tested by others or by ethicists, et cetera. How do you prevent that? How do you think through across like an enterprise-wide solid approach to trust?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's going to take time, and it may not be easy depending on the company. But I would think that there is a couple of areas that I know that we've taken and we're targeting. So to your point, trust being human and trying to map that into somewhat objective. I think one of the first principles and one of the first elements to explore is trying to break down some of those traditional silos and recognizing that impacts in one area will directly impact another, and they have to be therefore looked holistically. Many large companies will have a legal department separate from a regulatory department, separate from an ethics and compliance department, separate from a technology or security department, separate from a risk management department. So all of those can contribute and will contribute to the trust equation from an objective perspective. So first and foremost is breaking down those walls and making sure those communities and those folks are aligned, working together, working closely. Doesn't mean it has to be organizational, but they have to be tightly linked from an objectives perspective and from a work product perspective, from a collaboration perspective. Establishing governance or other checks and balances that take multiple perspectives into account, not just your individual function, is another really, really important one. Communities of practice are important here from an objectivity perspective, because a lot of these challenges from an ethical and responsible innovation perspective come from the fact that innovation, generally speaking, is linked with speed.
Totally.
And you have to really understand when you're innovating and recognize that innovation is going to be done in most successful companies. It's going to be done on the edge. There's not going to be one central group, and that's the only group allowed to innovate. The best innovation comes from the edge. So making sure there's a really, really robust communications program around what those principles are, where to go to get help. Is there somebody else that's had these same questions that I can talk to? So building that community and understanding that this is going to happen. I would also say that I'll call it energy to try to stop these types of things. A very traditional security trap is no. The lowest risk answer is to do nothing. But recognizing that this is going to happen and actually shift the mindset to be more enabling and discussing what you can do. Because let's face it, you recognize a lot of tremendous business value in some of these new analytics and some of these new innovations. So the question needs to shift from how can I stop it from happening in certain scenarios to recognizing the tremendous business value here, and let's work together to make sure it can be done responsibly.
Yeah, gosh, that it will go away if we pretend it's not there. Yeah, that we've moved way beyond that. I think we found that our McKinsey's research on AI, you have to scale AI is sort of just table stakes to a successful engagement in the digital economy. So given that, how is every organization going to deal with responsible AI and responsible data use and secure technology and ever evolving, given the threat vectors are ever evolving and the surface area is enlarging, and we are we're in this world that is, like, just from an objective standpoint, unstable. And we are in a world where innovation is rapid fire, so speedy. We are in a world where ChatGPT is on everyone's minds and conversations, and Bard and upcoming Playground, all the generative AI work that's just right here. I think it really mandates something that you raised earlier. You have to create these cross-disciplinary groups. I mean, this is not done in a silo. It's also not done at a board level. There has to be expertise. And I have a question on this note, because I'm a lawyer and now a consultant. I see a variety of, I have a vantage point, and we are all biased. I am biased. Every human is biased, that by nature. We can work on them and we can look for self-awareness, but we're all biased. So knowing that, and knowing we have limited perspective, how shall we think through the assembly of a good cross-functional team? And in particular, you came up through the CISO route, the Chief Information Security Officer. That's a sort of an ever-evolving role in and of itself. How do you think through, like, what people do you glue together to get this right? And what demographics do you glue together to get this right? How do you bring the best of, and I think there's a question in the chat around, bringing an ethicist into the equation too. What's the ideal cross-disciplinary team here?
Yeah, so you're right about the path that I took and whether or not the CISO is a good place to start here. I mean, keep in mind, there are some companies out there that have trust officers that are much more holistic than just digital trust, depending on the line of business you're in or the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. I think we are focusing on digital trust because frankly, one of the biggest shifts that we're making as a company and as an industry is rewiring how we work with data and digital. So that's a direct linkage to the digital challenges of trust. But from a CISO perspective and from a cyber perspective specifically, your motivator and your foundation is risk mitigation and protection, which is a good starting point because again, protecting the data, making sure that your systems and your technologies are resilient is a really, really strong starting point. And then you start to think about, and we in our instantiation, our version of this, we're focusing on 3 areas, to your point, as our first, I'll call it priority areas to really think about. And again, bringing the people together to do this well. Number 1 is how we capture, manage, protect our data. How we make sure that we're collecting it with the appropriate purpose. How we govern it appropriately. So all of the massive and vast amounts of data that you're capturing, I think I saw a statistic recently that 90% of the data captured in the healthcare industry was captured in the last year and a half. Mm-hmm. So the amount of data that you have and how you capture it and the protection and governance is area 1. Area 2 I mentioned before is that we're now digitally engaging with the ecosystem that we weren't doing as recently as 2 or 3 years ago. So patients may have apps, physicians may have apps, other parts of the external ecosystem may have apps, and you're digitally engaging with them, and therefore you're signing up to a responsibility to make sure that that digital engagement is robust, it's trusted, it's secure, it's as personalized as possible. Anything that makes them feel comfortable and feel safe in using it. And then thirdly, we talked about this a lot, Liz, is the ethical and responsible innovation piece. So the whole analytics elements, to your point, ethicists, responsible innovation experts, privacy experts, all of them are important from an ethical perspective. And we may pivot down the road when there's more value chain linkage, but those are the types of skills and those types of focus areas that we've brought together, building on the foundation of cyber. So it's it's another thing to note that traditional cyber looks to protect its company and its ability to operate using its systems. So, for example, your data, your applications, your systems, your platforms, cyber's traditional approach there is to make sure that that's protected and that's safe. But that's maybe potentially a technological or an IT-centric view. The reality is that most of our businesses, if they're not there already, every part of the business value chain and all of our business outcomes are underpinned by data and digital. So protecting the company is directly linked to protecting its technology.
100%. I mean, that is, it's the key asset to any organization. It's, to your point, the data that, we've seen countless companies who were not data companies or analytics companies by a long stretch, but they are now. They're sitting on a mountain of data. And so across all the sectors and around all the jurisdictions, there's so much you can do with it. And you raised a point around the different sources of data and the different apps. So again, with our patient/consumer hats on, let's think about the use of the data. And I think there's some questions in the chat around how we decide what data we use and for what benefit and so this kind of goes to ethics, but we think through, you had, and you said about losing trust is lost in buckets. I love it. I'm going to use that line. I love it. When we think through all the different apps and the, collection points and, customer journey, patient journey with data, and we think through the different ways that it can be used that is not helpful to us. And not helpful cannot just be like a data breach or, a really creepy overreach in surveillance, that sort of thing. But not helpful could just be there's too many portals. I go to my doctor and I get my blood pressure, measured, and there's all these things but then I need to go get a prescription filled and I need to do this, that, the other. At some point, it's just too much. So I guess the question I have for you is, when we think about how data can be used for a patient's benefit or a consumer's benefit, and presuming that's part of the ethics of a company, you're going to take the data, you're going to use it, but you're using it for the good of the consumer in some way. How can a trust framework ensure that? Like, thinking about the full journey of the data from the ideation of the use case, like what data should we collect, to the sourcing of the data, where should we get it, to the use of the data, how are we using it, in what use case, the processing all the way to data deletion. So that full journey of data. How do you make sure that you use it for the patient's benefit? How do you make sure you use it for consumers' benefit?
Yeah, intent and purpose are critically important from a principal's perspective, and understanding that and recognizing that, and also being quite transparent with those providing the data is really important. If you read studies, and I talked a little bit before about this, so where the industry is really trying to get to, and if you think about this from a transitional perspective, and frankly, some of the power of what data-driven health can give us, is most parts of the healthcare industry today rally around, and in some respects are incented on, how often you get treatment. And in many respects, the healthcare industry is designed to treat the sick. Where it's going and where it's shifting is to maintain your health. But so one of the things that needs to change, and companies like Takeda and others are working hard on this, is that how can you be sure, and how can you think about, rather than treatment volume, thinking about treatment quality. And the way you do that is you capture data that at least can show, or try to show, and make sure that you're very transparent on what you're capturing to do this and why you're capturing it. But how can we show the outcomes of how our treatments or how the medicines are working? There are some countries in Europe, for example, that are already talking about using that data point as a variable for how much the government will pay for the treatment. So outcomes being really important, and the value it provides being important. So I think and the way that we do that, and the way that you need to do that, is to think about data holistically. Who's the right steward of the data once it's captured? What's the difference between someone who collects it versus someone who processes it versus someone who moves it? What types of third parties are involved? So really understanding the rubric and the governance of what it means to capture and manage all that data is really important. Recognizing that everybody in some way, shape, or form will engage with data. Data is owned by a lot of different business units. It's not owned by somebody in the corner in IT. So business ownership of data is really important. And I know it may sound cliche or bumper sticker-ish, but recognizing that data is the fundamental asset and the fundamental driver for how these decisions are going to be made and how business outcomes are going to be delivered. There's a colleague of mine who always says, there's no digital without data. So it all starts with how the data is collecting, recognizing that and understanding how best to build the processes and build the appropriate controls in how data is captured is where that starts.
Yeah, I mean, yes, 100% on the data as the core asset. I think, in pharma in particular, I think there is a wonderful evolution, in my experience personally, of pharma being, we are here to meet your health, like your prescription needs and sort of clinical needs, to let's go into the wellness space. Let's go into the preventative healthcare space. And like, as we're speaking, my wearable is saying, please stand. And I'm thinking I can't, but I don't need to answer. But I think the behavioral nudging concept, that's great. It's great. We signed up for this. I bought it particularly to help nudge me. But I think when you think through kind of the future of pharma and the future of preventative care and where this is going and how data can be used to keep people from having to do sort of end stage care decisions, but rather, early stage, intercession care. When you think through that journey and how great that is for consumers, and then you think through the data that you might need to use to help serve patients and serve consumers in that way, it's kind of it's a strange balance. And I think it's still those decisions are still being made. How do you think through that from an ethical standpoint? And I won't go too much more into the ethics of it, although I could talk about that for years, but the ethics of how to help someone, but what's an overreach? That's that balance.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, one of the challenges that we're going to have to go through as an industry, is which part of the industry, for example, will address which pieces of this. So, where can and should pharma provide capability? Where can and should the insurance companies or the payers provide capability? What do we need to depend on for the hospitals and for the providers? I mean, one of the inherent challenges of data capture and using data ethically and with the right level of controls and governance is that, again, thinking back to what I said before about how we're all patients, most hospitals and most doctors do this differently. There's not a lot of standards about how the data is collected, how it's shared, how it's exchanged. So understanding that there are different pieces of the sector working on this. And as I said before, the tech companies recognize that as patients become more empowered with their health, there was a lot of unmet need, if you will, from an ongoing health management perspective. I mean, think about a company like a Peloton, which, frankly, is now classified by many people as a healthcare company because it's keeping you healthy. And it's one of those things where, and a lot of the, if you look at it from a broader economic perspective, a lot of the, out-of-pocket spend that we may put into healthcare is going to be more on the health side. Mm-hmm. And the health, I would say, maintenance side, if you will, and the wellness side. But again, I mean, thinking about it more holistically, our gym memberships, how we choose to eat our food, all of that at some point can and should it be classified as healthcare spend or part of this? So there's also the element of how all of this stitches together. I think from a pharma perspective, one of the things you're going to see quite soon, and what we're trying to do, frankly, is when you get, if we start talking about things like gene and cell therapies, then you get into the perspective of potential personalized care. So making sure that the care and the treatments are tied to the individual genetic makeup or some sort of a genetic indicator that makes you more susceptible to a disease, or looking for genetic indicators early that make you more susceptible from a rare disease perspective. So capturing blood and capturing genetic information to make that call is potentially and the right guardrails appropriate. But to your question about overstepping the bounds, do I want to use what people put on social media as a data point for an indicator of some sort of health condition? There's that potentially could be taking it too far. So there's checks and balances here from a scientific perspective as well as a data gathering perspective that we're moving through. But I do think, broadly speaking, there's going to be a lot more focus and a lot more digital disruption on the wellness side that will make the rest of the industry interface with a lot of this data more directly and more widely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for some of that. I'm all for most of that. I think so I'll give a personal example because I'm very public with this, that I have celiac disease, and I am all for anything that can help me eat a cinnamon roll in some future state when treatment has evolved. Great, fantastic, really looking forward to that. But in the meantime, what I would not love is for some sort of predictive analytics to determine that because I have celiac, I am not a good underwriting, candidate. Right. I shouldn't be working McKinsey. You can go with this, but I think that's something too, where we think through, again, the advantage using the data. And this is probably when we think about codified regulations on this in the future, thinking through the data be used for the data subject's benefit and not their harm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think. Okay. So Mike,
you drink 3 beers and have a quarter pounder doesn't mean your insurance premium should go up the next month.
I know, and then you just capture it. Your one trip to In-N-Out Burger gets captured on social media, and then you get the premium hike the next day. Yeah, I mean that's something that I think we all want to avoid, but yet we are saying yes to telematics in the auto industry, and folks are saying, yeah, sure, measure my driving. You can know when I stop and I start and how fast I go, and if I'm talking on the phone. That's a lot of data that people are willing to hand over, but they do it if it benefits them and it lowers their premiums. So I think we are in an interesting phase as consumers too. What data are we willing to hand over, and what implications do they have? I want to ask one last question, and then we can pivot to the official Q&A, which is, so I have a tween and a teen, and they're both kind of looking at my job, and they're like, I get that it's AI related, but I'm not sure what, and I think mostly they think I email, but I wonder what advice you'd give to students to just finishing undergrad or finishing a master's program or a PhD program, that how can you inform their own data leadership in whatever field they go into, because of the ubiquity of data that we were talking about. What advice would you give to them as they think through data leadership in future generations and future jobs that don't even exist yet?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll try to answer it succinctly because I think you can go to a lot of different paths. I would say, again, I brought this up before, that many of our students nowadays are very, very accustomed to digital, and it's basically intertwined with and wired into their DNA. So, however, where maybe the shock, if you will, is that the digital capabilities that we're all inherently used to, that the data sets that we expect for the digital to act upon aren't quite there yet. So there's an impatience to create data lakes or get more data. So as you mentioned, data is key. Anything from a data science, data stewardship, data engineering, data modeling is a really, really important piece and something to really, really focus on. But I would also say two other things. A lot of what we're talking about here comes down to experience. And experience, again, from a patient's perspective, somebody looking to get and receive healthcare or on health management overall, thinking about the experience overall, the experience, frankly, of a physician or a nurse or a healthcare practitioner. So experience, again, brings back the human side. Mm-hmm. So don't underestimate the power of something like anthropology, something that you can think about from a culture and people perspective, depending on where the types of treatments or the areas that you may want to get into, at least from a healthcare perspective. The cultural challenges in the US are very different than the cultural challenges from Indonesia, for example, and the healthcare experience requirements for that. So understanding culturally is what's really, really important. And finally, I would just say, I know this is less about study, but more about a mindset, but be curious. Most people that I know are not in the field that they got their degree in. And as long as you're curious, and as long as you're passionate, my best advice would be to follow your heart and find where you think you're going to add the most value, because that's really, really where. Because again, before, so much is going to be underpinned with data. Anything you work on is going to require a data mindset. So that's a really, really important foundation.
I love it. That's such good advice. I love that too. I think anthropology and sociology and psychology, those are things you can't really outsource at the moment to, for instance, generative AI. And I think also that buildup of empathy, to bring to any role, but also on the data dignity and digital dignity front is such a future mandate. Okay, well, we promised we'd turn over to Q&A. Mike, understanding too that you are one of the first, and this is a growing position, but I also want folks that are listening to understand the Chief Digital Trust Officer is really like a forefront position, and I think it's where the puck is headed. But I also know that you have really fought a lot of battles to get to raise this issue to the level of not only discourse within an organization, but an actual position within an organization. So such a treat to get to hear from you, having known the path that you've walked to get here. Jen, I know you're going to moderate Q&A, so I welcome your questions.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think that, the discussion was so interesting. And what I really loved is, part of what we think about at the Harvard Data Science Initiative is that data is everywhere and in all disciplines, right? And so I think part of our mandate is to help people understand that they are data scientists. They are somewhere in the data value chain and thinking about, what data they're collecting, how they're using it, what are the results of that, is, I think, central to what education is like in this day and age. So I love that, we sort of have these aligned points of view. So this one is a little bit of future thinking, but Victor Capo asks, is the current state of data security architecture and tools secure enough to support the evolution to a fully integrated, interoperable future for sensitive data? What do you think?
In my opinion, it's a great question. Most data security, I'll call it capabilities, have been built around the concept of data being, not to be too hung up on words, but I admit, frankly, I do. I mean, it's the pain of being a former journalist. I get hung up on semantics, but data security concepts, a lot of them are linked to content. So the Word documents you write, or the PowerPoints you build, or the Excels, or the PDFs, so that content, if you will, is where a lot of the historical data security architectures were built. The challenge is that, as we all know, the data volumes and the data types that we're capturing and how it's organized and how it's gathered are a whole different level now. When you think about it in the healthcare space, in the pharma space, computational chemistry, gene sequencing, other algorithmic data for protein synthesis, all of these data sets are massive and they change regularly. Even in my own internal team, to protect the company from a security perspective, we ingest 22 billion new data records a day into our analytics engine. So the volumes are completely different. So I think the current state of data security architecture has to get better from a scale perspective, first and foremost. And I think it also has to come up from an integration perspective to make sure that things like sharing is key, or there's a hyper cloud war going on with the Googles and the Microsofts and the AWSs of the world. There needs to be better commonality for there, because your data is going to move around a lot. So there needs to be some sort of structures for how the data can interrelate. So I do think and the last thing I would say where we need more data security architecture improvement is anonymization. Is making sure that the privacy is protected as well at some level of scale, that we can maintain the efficacy and the veracity of the data, but also understand that we have an obligation to protect the privacy of the components that are represented within the data.
So this is actually a lovely segue into another question that was asked, which is around efficacy. And I guess I would say continued security, which is, how often are you thinking about auditing not only the data itself, but the decisions that you use to get to where you are in terms of your approaches to the security and privacy of the data that you're using?
Yeah, so checkpoints are important. I mean, given from a scale perspective, I think from an overall industry perspective, I think security has become a math problem. And I'll speak in simplistic terms. Security used to be some intelligence provider, law enforcement, or whatever, would tell me all the bad stuff is going on, and I would maintain that list and block it. That's what security used to be, is block what's bad. Then for a while, frankly, because of we can all talk about, how some of the hacking community evolved or whatever, but then it shifted to, there was frankly more bad stuff than good. So it became easier to allow the good than to block the bad. And now we're in a position nowadays where there's so much data and things are growing so quickly that math and analytics are your best security control. What I mean by that is figuring out what normal looks like and trying to find signals of abnormality. That's where the security is evolving, and that needs to be augmented with occasional auditing and the appropriate level of auditing to make sure that you have the right checks and balances to make sure that those math models that you built are actually working.
I might add there to say, I saw a question in the Q&A about the 5-step test or whatever you do. I think just from a metaphor standpoint, we love to use the aviation checklist because no one wants the plane they are flying in to have any critical fail. And so so you think about, your data being used in some critical path the path is yielding an outcome that is critical to you, and wanting that to be really tested and really sure. Mike raised a really important point around when you are scaling these processes, automation is so key. So like privacy enhancing technologies, making that automated so that people don't forget. And then also having a comprehensive checklist that you do put things through helps not only from a performance standpoint, but it also helps from an audit standpoint. When you're thinking about looking back, if something went wrong, you can say, no, this is what we did. This is the 5 or 25 or 35 step checklist that we follow. And I think that's part of a trust strategy, is building out what steps are you always going to follow, and at what, and then that continually evolves as the threats evolve. It continually evolves as the innovation evolves. But I think the dynamic aviation checklist, if you leave that in your head, is really key. Automating any of those steps whenever possible so that it will happen.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful advice. And yes, the comparison to aviation, or a few years ago, the surgical checklist, right? So
yeah, searching for food safety or anything that you were like, please go well, please go well.
So here's an interesting question. Is a for-profit company that necessarily has to respond to shareholders the best place to establish trust around health and livelihood? And what's a better framework? And I might, rephrase that a little bit to say, we know that, that there are certain stakeholders that you have to be responsible to. And how do you think of yourself in relation to other stakeholders in the space in establishing these frameworks, right? So are there commonalities that you can pull out working with your peers and working with other places in the space, people in the space, like NGOs, for example? How do you think about the shared burden of creating these trust frameworks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's a great question with a challenging answer. I mean, you're right. I mean, there is potential motivational questions that need to be asked from a for-profit, nonprofit societal impact. I mean, at the end of the day, at least in my industry, it's all about the patient and what's best for the patient. That has to be first and foremost. And our commitment from a sustainability perspective and from a societal impact perspective, the public and the shareholders need to hold us accountable for that, because that's what we're in the business of doing, is making sure that we operate within that level of appropriate guardrails. I think the for-profit companies, frankly, are the ones that tend to have the most to invest in this. So from an innovation perspective, it's the right balance there. There's a lot of ways that's where the innovation comes from, in combination with the innovation that goes on at the edge from an open source perspective. But you're right. I mean, a perfect example of where these two things have to come together is I brought up the issue before about, or the challenge before, about collecting outcomes data and measuring how patients' conditions may improve if they're on a certain medication or they're on a certain treatment. Collecting that data is one thing, but you have to ask yourself a question. Once you start capturing that data and you start to see trends, how much of that is the medicine? How much of that is the care they're getting from their physician? Or maybe potentially, lifestyle changes or things like that. So there's other factors that, even though the data is there and can be viewed, and so that example is where the partnership between the providers and the medicine and the treatment manufacturers need to come together, because they're both involved in that care experience.
And it will be regulated. I mean, it's not unregulated. It is largely wonderful that for-profit companies are addressing trust. It's wonderful that they are thinking through these second-order implications of combining data or root cause, from a data shift. So I think, but underpinning all of this, of course, is an ever-evolving, dynamic regulatory environment where things are made, mandated or prohibited. And we're seeing this across all the industries. We're seeing it in banking with open banking. We're seeing it in insurance with underwriting. We're seeing it in pharma with, clinical trials. And so this is something too, when back to the cross-disciplinary functions that you build, everyone has to pivot when something becomes mandatory. And then wonderfully, if that's the floor, if compliance is the floor, the ethics are what you do on top of that. And I think that's where the trust function is largely focused.
Yeah, I think I think that there is this is just such an interesting space, and it calls for these coalitions, right? I think the industry is so far ahead in terms of how you're using the data, and I think that for us in academia, obviously we're interested in seeing from research perspective how this plays out. Thanks, Mike and Liz, and thanks to our audience for your super thoughtful questions. Our next seminar in the series is March 2nd, and we'll be exploring digital trust as a global framework with the World Economic Forum. You can sign up on our website. It's in the chat box. And you can also check out our other upcoming sessions. So we hope to see you then. All right. With that, I'll thank our speakers once again. Take care and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.